infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey, everybody. This is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, my guest today writes in a recent article in the American Society for Microbiology that norovirus is known as the perfect pathogen, and today we'll find out why. In addition, she writes that your blood type could be a factor in your susceptibility for the disease. So joining me today to look at norovirus and some of these very interesting things that we're learning about this virus is Madeline Barron, Ph.D. Dr. Barron is the Science Communication Specialist at the ASM. Dr. Barron, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. We've talked about norovirus on this show several times, but I still, just in case this is the first time somebody watches, let's start with a summary of norovirus. Dr. Barron, how common is norovirus, particularly in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it's pretty common. In the U.S., we have around 19 to 21 million cases of norovirus every year. And it is, one of the most common causes of gastroenteritis worldwide, with about 685 million infections across the world every year. So pretty common.
And the symptoms, what's typical?
Yeah, so generally symptoms of norovirus start to appear between 12 and 48 hours after exposure to the virus. And the most common ones include diarrhea, profuse vomiting, nausea, stomach pain. Someone may also experience a fever, headache, or body aches, but definitely the gastrointestinal symptoms are the big ones.
Yeah, so it's just a nasty little bug, right?
It's not the best.
Yeah, right. And how does it transmit to people? How would I contract norovirus?
Yeah, so for norovirus to cause disease, it has to be ingested in some way. So you can get norovirus by accidentally getting tiny particles of feces or vomit in your mouth from a person who is infected with norovirus. This sounds really gross, but it can happen, for example, as particles are aerosolized during vomiting or toilet flushing. The virus can also spread if someone consumes food or drink that's been contaminated with norovirus, or touches a surface that's been contaminated with the virus and then touches their mouth. So that type of contamination can happen if someone who has norovirus touches these surfaces, prepares food for people, or again, if the virus is aerosolized and lands on surfaces.
Okay, excellent. So that's a little summary of the organism and the disease that it may cause. Let's go ahead and dive into your article on the American Society for Microbiology website entitled Susceptibility to Norovirus Might Depend on Blood Type. And you wrote about quite a few kind of interesting things. And I want to go ahead and start with, you say that some scientists call norovirus the perfect pathogen. I love that name. Why is that?
Yeah, so the thing about norovirus is that it's a hardy virus. So some viruses like SARS-CoV-2 or influenza have a fragile envelope that surrounds them, but norovirus doesn't. So it has just this protein shell that is sort of like the molecular equivalent of a bulletproof vest. So this makes the virus really able to withstand environmental stressors like high temperatures, certain disinfectants. And because norovirus can withstand these stressors, it can persist on surfaces for a couple weeks. So this resistance and persistence are key pieces here. Another feature is that it doesn't take much to make someone sick. So as few as 100 viral particles, which means that even minimal exposure to the virus can lead to disease. There's also the fact that some genotypes of the virus, particularly those that frequently cause outbreaks, mutate quickly. So this high evolution rate means that formation of long-lasting immunity sometimes is a little bit more difficult. So immunity to norovirus is generally considered short-lived. There are studies that vary in how long it lasts, from a few months to a year. But in any case, all of these factors, rapid evolution, waning immunity, high transmissibility, a low infectious dose, including others that we didn't even touch on here, those are kind of the things that have prompted scientists to call it the perfect human pathogen.
Yeah. Now, something else that you discussed in your article, which I enjoyed tremendously, some studies suggest that the individual's blood type could determine their susceptibility to the virus. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I dive into that a little bit, I'll give some background so it's a little bit easier to understand. So on the surface of epithelial cells, red blood cells, secretions like saliva, there are these molecules called histoblood group antigens, or HBGAs. And the structure of these molecules determines blood type according to the ABO system. So how it works is we have enzymes that attach short sugars onto a sort of backbone carbohydrate molecule to create what's called the H antigen. And the H antigen can then be modified into A and B antigens. So that is where we get our A, B, or AB type blood, depending on what you're expressing. So for people with type O blood, the H antigen remains unmodified. So one of these enzymes that is responsible for tacking these sugars onto this antigen is called Pht2. And Pht2 is mainly expressed in mucus-secreting tissues like the intestine. So histoblood group antigens controlled by this enzyme are found attached to the surface of these tissues, so in the intestine, or sort of floating around in blood, saliva, milk. So in some cases, people have genetic mutations that makes this enzyme inactive. So these people are what's known as non-secretors because they do not secrete these histoblood group antigens in their mucosa, in their gut. So with that in mind, we'll circle back to norovirus. So what scientists have found is that histoblood group antigen expression in the intestine is important for norovirus to initiate infection. So specifically, the virus binds the H antigen or variations of the H antigen like A or B, again, coming back to what's determining our blood type here, to attach to or enter the cell. And scientists aren't quite sure exactly these early infection dynamics, but it appears to be important in some way. But what this means is that in secretors, this isn't really a problem because they have this active enzyme, and so they're expressing these antigens in their intestine for norovirus to attach to. In non-secretors, the virus might be out of luck because they're lacking those cellular markers needed for the virus to establish infection. So this means that non-secretors are resistant to some genotypes of norovirus, including those that are often responsible for outbreaks. So while I do want to note that, while secretor status and these blood group antigens in general are a key determinant of susceptibility, and that if you have them or if you don't or whatever you're expressing, there's some correlation there. There is nuance to how protective it is. So some genotypes of virus, it doesn't really matter if you're secreting or not. They can bind other markers on the cell surface. So even non-secretors have those and they're just as susceptible. And also not every secretor is equally susceptible. So there was a study that found that expressing type B antigen, so having a B blood type, correlated with a lack of susceptibility to a particular type of the virus. There was another study that found that having blood type A, B, or AB did not affect susceptibility, but having type O blood was tied to an increased risk of infection. So, the bottom line here is that there is this link between, for sure, the presence or absence of these histoblood group antigens and norovirus infection, and potentially the type of antigen you're expressing. But as I mentioned, there's a little bit of nuance to those dynamics.
Yeah. So having the universal blood type, that you're the unlucky one, huh?
In that study, it appears.
Yeah. Well, I found it really interesting, but none of this stuff is written in stone or anything at this point, right?
No, not yet. But there is definitely that connection.
Yeah.
Always teasing apart the mechanism, though.
Yeah. And then you also read about how some studies suggest that the human microbiome can also influence norovirus infection. What do these studies conclude?
Yeah, so that's also an interesting area of ongoing investigation. So, what's interesting with this is that in some ways it actually ties back to these blood group antigens, in that studies have shown that some gut bacteria produce molecules on their surface that look a lot like these antigens. So, they sort of mimic them. Because of this, norovirus can bind these bacterial structures, which, based on experiments in the lab, so in vitro studies, has what appears to be important implications for viral replication. So there was a study, for example, that found that for norovirus to infect B cells, as an example, these HBGA expressing gut bacteria must be present. Another study showed that and having bacteria that express these antigen-like, blood group antigen-like molecules protect the virus from heat stress, potentially other stressors too. Those would need to be tested, but scientists don't really understand the why behind these interactions. But the results, like the studies I just mentioned, suggest the microbiota influences infection in some way. There's also other compounds associated with microbial metabolism, like bile acids, that have been linked to norovirus replication and facilitate binding to blood group antigens in particular. And it's also worth noting that, we know it is well known at this point that interactions with the immune system and the gut microbiota shape immune responses to infection. So this also appears to be the case in the context of norovirus, with these sort of microbiota immune interactions playing a role in modulating norovirus infection dynamics and duration. So again, an area that's really interesting and continues to develop.
Right. Yeah, really good stuff. And for most people, they know maybe some of the basics about norovirus, but this new stuff that's coming out is incredibly fascinating. At least to me, it is. And so let's jump into something a little bit more on the practical side. And I think this month or next month is the beginning of the primary cruise season. What can people do to prevent norovirus?
Yeah, so washing your hands with soap and water is a big one. Before eating, after using the bathroom, touching things that other people have touched, like stair railings if you're at the buffet, touching the handles and then going back to your seat to eat something, wash your hands before you would start eating. Always avoid touching your face. And I want to note that we hear a lot about outbreaks of norovirus on cruises because these are very well tracked, very well documented. So it seems like they're happening all the time. But in the general population, there are plenty of outbreaks and cases too. We usually see a peak in norovirus cases between November and April just every year. So for everyone, those same practices apply. Wash your hands, preparing food safely, using disinfectants that are effective against the virus. So the CDC recommends a bleach solution. And all of these actions are especially important if you or someone around you has had norovirus. It's good to be especially vigilant in that case.
Because of the way norovirus is structured, is using alcohol for your hands effective?
They've shown that alcohol for your hands isn't effective for norovirus. You do have to actually physically wash your hands with soap and water. Yeah.
Okay. And my last question is, what about a vaccine? Is there a vaccine currently, or are there anything in the pipeline?
We don't currently have a norovirus vaccine, but there are, yes, a couple candidates in the pipeline. So this includes an mRNA vaccine by Moderna and also a virus-like particle vaccine from a company called Hilvax. And this latter one has shown promise for preventing moderate to severe cases of acute gastroenteritis from norovirus infection in phase 2 clinical trials. So these vaccines would be particularly beneficial for those who are more vulnerable to serious infection, like young people, those who are immunocompromised, part of the elderly population. So we don't have anything quite yet, but hopefully soon.
Yeah, well, that's good news. And for those that are interested, I will put a link to Dr. Barron's ASM article in the show notes so you can check it out for yourself. Good stuff. And I want to thank you, Dr. Madeline Barron, for sharing your time and expertise, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was fun to be here.
All right, thanks.